May see some showers throughout the day. Into Wales, let's go to Wales. And there we may also see the odd stray shower at the coast, otherwise it'll be cold but sunny. Sun will also shine across the Midlands during the rest of today, with very little cloud in the sky. Despite the sun, it'll be cold, with a high of 8 degrees Celsius, moving into northern England. And the best of the sunshine will be across the west, with some shower clouds affecting eastern coasts through the day. Top temperatures here of 8 Celsius. Southern Scotland will also see the sunshine, but further north it's going to be rather cloudy with some spells of rain. It'll be milder here with highs of 10 degrees Celsius possible. The north coast of Northern Ireland is where we're headed to now as we head west, and the north coast of Northern Ireland will also be rather cloudy during Monday, but all elsewhere they'll be back in the sunshine with a high of 9 degrees Celsius. Much of the UK then holding on to clear skies as we approach dusk, leading to a chilly evening.
Brr.
Thank you, Rosie. And that is how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage. I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Is number 10 dangerously incompetent? This is the accusation that has been levelled at them by the Labour Party. This morning we'll be discussing some big issues that number 10 has to tackle and whether it's doing them well. We'll be talking about terrorism, about migrant crossings and a little bit about COVID. All that and so much more to come in 5 minutes' time on The Briefing.
Very good morning to you. I'm Paul Hawkins. Our top story this hour. 5 people have died and more than 40 have been injured after a car ploughed through a Christmas parade in the American state of Wisconsin. An SUV broke through barriers in the city of Waukesha yesterday afternoon, hitting dozens of people, including children. One eyewitness said the SUV was doing 40 miles per hour when it hit the crowd. Police Chief Dan Thompson said a person of interest was in custody, but it was not known whether the incident was terrorism related.
The most important thing is the families of this tragic event and making sure that the next of kin is conducted. And then we're working with the families. That is our priority in this tragic incident.
New homes in England must have electric car charging points installed from next year. The new measures will also force new supermarkets and workplaces, including those undergoing major renovations, to include charging points. This follows the government pledge to end the sale of new petrol and diesel cars in 2030. Austria has become the first Western European country to enter a fourth nationwide lockdown to tackle soaring coronavirus cases. Austrians have to stay home and can only, for essential reasons, leave, for reasons like food shopping, going to the doctor and exercising. Restaurants and most shops have closed and larger events have been cancelled. The government will re-evaluate the lockdown after 10 days. The government is facing a potential backlash from Tory MPs over changes to social care plans. Previously, the government said there would be a cap of £86,000 on care costs by 2023, but it's now considering a change to how contributions are calculated. Council funding support will no longer count towards that limit. Under the plans, only an individual's personal payments will be considered. Once the limit is hit, the local authority will pay the same. Some backbench MPs say the changes could hit poorer people hardest. The least well-off may have to sell their home, which would break a Tory manifesto pledge. Australia will begin to allow foreign visitors to enter the country from the start of December. Skilled workers, international students and refugees will be given priority, but they must hold an eligible visa and be fully vaccinated against COVID. The country did have one of the strictest border policies, allowing a limited number of Australians and permanent residents in. The number of people contacting the NSPCC with concerns about child sexual abuse has hit a record level. The helpline received over 4,000 calls during the 6 months to October. That's up 36% from the same period in 2020. The charity said survivors are motivated to step forward amid a surge in publicity about sexual violence against women and girls. The government is reportedly considering housing migrants that cross the Channel in army barracks rather than hotels to try and save money. It's also looking at the possibility of offshoring migrants in a third country as their applications are processed. The government has come under pressure over an increase in the number of migrants entering the country from France. More than 24,700 people have arrived in the UK so far this year, more than 3 times the number in 2020. Shoppers have been warned to be extra careful during Black Friday as millions of pounds were lost to scams over Christmas last year. Action Fraud, which is the National Reporting Centre for Fraud and Cybercrime, saw more than 28,000 people conned out of their money during the festive period. That's an increase of 61% compared with the year before. Nearly £2.5 million was lost to criminals during the Black Friday and Cyber Monday sale events last year. Personal finance expert Laura Retty told GBNews that scams have become so sophisticated that anyone could be at risk.
Those scammers obviously work year-round. Black Friday does prove to be particularly lucrative because the psychology often is with retailers. You have to do things in a rush because the bargains won't stick around for long, so shoppers aren't as focused or perhaps as cautious as usual, especially online.
That's all from us for now. We'll update you on those headlines in half an hour.
A very good morning to you. Boris and Sir Keir are at the CBI today, attempting to woo the big business community. Good luck. But back in Westminster, rebellion is brewing over the particulars of the Prime Minister's social care plan to be voted on this evening. This is just the latest in a long line of rebellions being faced by an increasingly beleaguered Number 10. Down in the polls, largely as a result of a spectacular own goal over standards reform. As the Prime Minister himself put it, when faced with an open road, he succeeded in crashing the car into a ditch. A not too dissimilar metaphor to Dominic Cummings' favourite description of the Prime Minister as an uncontrollable supermarket trolley crashing from aisle to aisle. Continual U-turns, rebellions, backbench unease, and now a slide in the polls. Well, what's causing all of these mistakes in Number 10? Has the Prime Minister surrounded himself by too many yes men and not enough challenge? Well, let's speak to commentator and former Downing Street advisor Tim Montgomery to get his take on exactly what the issue seems to be. Because I think most people understand there is an issue in Number 10 right now.
Absolutely, and I think there's been an issue for a long time, Tom. My period inside Downing Street was a very brief one, but I got to know Boris Johnson very well over a series of meetings over a number of years beforehand. And what was clear is that Boris does need someone who is a truth teller around him, someone who will stand up to him in a way that people who don't know him that well, are reluctant to do so. And I was particularly impressed by the role that his former wife, Marina Wheeler, played in his life. She was the rock, really, around which and his life was built. And I think her absence from that sort of truth-telling role is particularly significant. And of course, by the nature of it, very difficult to replace.
So in some respects, in your view, this is more of a personal issue than a political one?
In large part, I think that's absolutely right. We all know that there is Boris's personal life is colourful, without going into all of the details. And we also know that when he was mayor of London, he had a very powerful sort of right-hand man, Simon Milton, the former leader of Westminster City Council, who sadly died very prematurely. And there's always been that really significant person alongside Boris, someone who he trusts, but someone who will stand up to him and sort of correct his weaknesses. And I think it's the absence of that person that is particularly acute at the moment. It's nearly 2 years ago, though, that I proposed to the Prime Minister that he introduce someone who perhaps a former Chief of Staff from the White House or a former head of the Australian Prime Minister's office to conduct a thoroughgoing review of the Downing Street operation. Have a look at it from first principles to see how, in the 21st century, with all the complexities of modern government, his office could be run. And he seemed keen on the idea, but never actually acted on it. And I think that also is a lack. There's a haphazard construction to the team around him that means that the problem I diagnosed at the beginning of that absence of that one sort of strong continuous figure is only exacerbated.
And there seem to be a number of power bases in Number 10 as well, one clustering around the Prime Minister's wife, Carrie Johnson, and one clustering around Dan Rosenfield. Which do you think is winning out?
I don't know, really. I'm probably not close enough to it now. Probably, I would say, looking from the outside, as all of your viewers are doing as well, Tom, is I would conclude that no one is really winning out, because if someone was really in the ascendancy, you would probably get some sort of continuity of approach. That one faction would be seeing its methods and its objectives coming through more than any other. I don't see that pattern of continuity from Downing Street at all at the moment, and I think that is the primary weakness. I think a common factor amongst all of the factions, though, that are currently there is just the lack of experience. They're all quite young, and I think perhaps some addition of grey power, if you like, people who've been round the block once or twice would be welcome, not just inside Number 10 Downing Street, but around the cabinet table as well. There are a lot of ministers on the Tory backbenches who I think could add some firepower to the cabinet, but currently aren't being used.
I always wonder how much the cabinet actually is able to change all that much. It seems to be these days much more of a rubber stamping body than the advisors, of course, the unelected advisors within Number 10. Boris Johnson, of course, lost Steady Eddie, Sir Eddie Lister, his senior advisor that was with him throughout his mayoralty and also early premiership recently. There's also been another very high-profile departure around this time last year, of course, of Dominic Cummings. I wonder, to what extent has that changed the dynamics within Number 10 in your view?
I think there are obviously significant figures. Eddie Lister, who was the person who replaced Simon Milton at Boris's right hand when he was mayor of London, didn't particularly want to come out of retirement, but Boris really encouraged him to come into 10 Downing Street. but I don't think he was ever really fully committed to the role. And when you are Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, you really do have to be prepared to run at 100 miles per hour just to keep on top of things. And I don't think Eddie Lister's heart really was in doing that. So always there's been that sort of that essential role, a chief of staff in Downing Street, someone who has the Prime Minister's ear and who people know has the Prime Minister's ear. It really is someone who's seen in charge. There's never been that person alongside Boris Johnson. It was, of course, briefly Dominic Cummings, but even he was beset by factions as well. And he didn't really undertake that other important role that a good chief of staff would undertake and listen to people. It was very much for Dominic Cummings his way or no way, and he really sort of didn't listen to alternative sources of wisdom. And when you are running something as complex as a government of a Western state as advanced as Britain, you need to listen to alternative sources of wisdom. And although Dominic Cummings was brilliant in many ways, and the British Conservative Party owes him a lot for some of his insights into how to win Brexit, get Brexit across the line, how to win the 2019 general election. He should always been part of a team rather than head of a team. And so that search for an assertive, knowledgeable chief of staff to really to be a counterweight to the Prime Minister's weaknesses, that search of that person is still not complete in Boris Johnson's case.
Really, really interesting how there doesn't seem to be that sort of counterweight there at the top at the moment. Just finally in this conversation, Tim, is this normal? Is this to be expected? We're 2 years into a government. This is the definition of mid-term. And the Tories, yes, they're behind in the polls, but not by all that much.
Well, look, if you are worried about whether the Conservatives can win the next general election, I think the chances of the Conservatives winning the next election are still incredibly good. There are a number of structural factors, including Labour's failure to make any real advances in Scotland. I think there are various cultural war issues, for want of a better expression, particularly about what kids are being taught in schools, that I think the Conservative Party can use to their advantage incredibly well at the next general election. And so as a Conservative supporter, I'm optimistic about Conservative chances. If, however, your primary concern is this country being well governed at the moment? Is the Conservative Party making use of a once-in-a-generation opportunity to use a majority of 80 to change the nature of the country, to ensure that reforms are made that make us more competitive, that our children are better taught, etc., 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 then I think you have to be very gloomy. The government isn't using its time in office well. It isn't drafting legislation well. It is U-turning constantly. It's not a government with a strategic or a composed sense of direction. And that, I'm afraid, is what it badly needs to be corrected. And I see little immediate prospect of it being so.
Well, a gloomy way to end that interview there, but
sorry about that, Tom.
We always appreciate your analysis here on GB News. Thanks for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Now, as hundreds of migrants continue to arrive on UK shores every day, despite the colder weather, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has asked a cross-government task force to consider options to deter migrants from crossing the Channel. The latest option being considered is to house asylum seekers in army barracks rather than hotels while they await processing. Cabinet Office Minister Stephen Barclay will chair the first meeting of the new task force early this week in a bid to address the Channel crossing crisis. The Labour Party has hit out at the Tories this weekend, accusing Priti Patel of dangerous incompetence. But are they right? And is the latest government initiative going to work? Well, let's talk to Craig McKinley, the Conservative MP for Thanet South in Kent, a constituency bearing much of the brunt of these illegal landings. Craig, thank you for joining us this morning. Is the government doing enough?
I think the government is looking for all avenues that might stop the pull factors. I mean, that's what this is key. We have to stop the viability of this route. We've heard of a number of proposals over the last few months. The last one being the pushback scheme, which I always had some doubts over. because of safety at sea issues, and I just never thought it would work. And yes, and lo and behold, it has never been tried yet. But the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is making its way through Parliament, is the new great hope. And yes, it has some very, very robust measures, probably the most robust bill on these type of issues that we've seen for over a generation, to make it very difficult to claim asylum if you've come in on an irregular route. The prospect of offshoring processing centres, which again I think has got some value, but we have got a long way between today and when that bill becomes an act, probably not until the spring next year. And we've got numbers of, we saw on the 4th of November, 1,185 came in on one day, only 10% were stopped by the French authorities. We need something new, and we need it desperately, because I have to tell you, Tom, on the back of what Tim was saying, this is an issue which is hemorrhaging our votes across the country. I'm feeling that on the doorstep. I've got a couple of rather more high-octane solutions to this problem. I mean, number one, I would have thought would be to return the migrants immediately after they've landed on Kentish shores back to France, because at the end of the day, that was virtually the deal the French have said they can do for us, backed up with a load of British taxpayers' cash. The second one would be, I think, very, very apposite at the moment, considering what's happening on the Poland-Belarus border. Poland have asked and begged and been very, very warmly welcoming help from the international community to strengthen that border. How about a very broad and warm offer to the French authorities to say, you're obviously struggling with this on the 100 miles of beaches from whence the crossings start. How many of our border force and perhaps troops do you need to strengthen that further? I can see nothing else in the short term just at the moment from where I'm sitting.
You think that Stephen Barclay, who of course will be having meetings across government this week about this all, will be listening to those concerns of you and your colleagues who are in the area involved? Will the government be listening to those suggestions, and what are the potential of the government taking those on board?
Well, I think what Minister Barclay is trying to do is to look across government and see what pull factors we've uniquely created for ourselves and how some of those can be closed down. One that we heard on your report was that processing centres should be barracks or some similar institutions and not dispersed into hotels. Because it doesn't take too much thinking about the prospect of a winter sleeping rough in North Kent, northern France's woodland is not very appealing when the thought is you can get across the channel and be put in a hotel for some months. So that's potentially one pull factor. But the big one, which we've failed on over the last 18 months with COVID given as the usual excuse, is that the court system has not been working very effectively. We've had virtually zero repatriations of failed asylum seekers across that period. So I think the thoughts amongst the people traffickers, and they're obviously selling it to their, I call them cargo, because these people traffickers care little to nothing about the people they're transporting, is that, well, you get yourself to Britain, there's very little prospect of you getting returned, and you'll have a pretty decent existence for a few months while the system puts you into it, and you could be stuck in the system for many years, and you can probably disappear into the underground economy. Of course, Britain's always had that pull factor of the English language being the lingua franca of the world, the second language that most people will have picked up over their years. And so we do have some unique pull factors, but we shouldn't forget that all of these people on the Northern France shores are people that have been failed by the EU system. Frontex has broken down. The Dublin III Accords, which all EU members have signed up to, really those in France that shouldn't be in France should be being returned internally to the country in which they made their first entry for processing. So there's something breaking down within the EU's own system. But we mustn't forget that France and Germany do have an awful lot more asylum-seeking claims than we do in the UK. But the pure visuals of 1,000 people some days coming over, I mean, it just looks like a failure of statecraft. So something really needs to be done. And politically, I mean, we all have the odd leak in our house. We put a bucket under it. Where we are at the moment, it looks like the ceilings are coming through. It's really that serious, Tom.
No, it's a strong metaphor there. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave this conversation there today, but no doubt this will be back again. I mean, we've seen what's happening on the Belarusian-Poland border. We've seen what's happened in Afghanistan. This is going to come back and bite, no doubt. But for now, Craig McKinley, thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Now, Austria has entered another national lockdown, and there have been large, violent protests against further restrictions in Belgium. As a fresh wave of COVID sweeps through Europe, will we see it crash down on our shores, closing our businesses and restricting our lives too? Well, the man behind the Oxford vaccine, Sir Andrew John Pollard, thinks that's unlikely. He said yesterday that we've actually had some spread going on since the summer. And so I think it's unlikely that we're going to see a very sharp rise in the next few months that has been seen in Europe. We're already ahead with this particular virus. And his words ring true. Let's take a look at cases as they stand in Europe now. UK cases rose beyond many other countries in July and have bumped along relatively flatly since then. On the other hand, European countries that suppressed their cases over the summer have seen cases spike in the last few weeks. Could it be that unlocking when we did, seeing our cases rise when they did at a time of lower pressure on the NHS, is helping to protect the NHS this winter and made our lives less miserable in the summer? Quite possibly. Professor Chris Whitty said as much standing alongside Boris at the press conference announcing what the media called Freedom Day. He said whenever ending restrictions occurs, cases will rise, and there's good logic to say that it's better to do that in the summer than later on. The pro-restriction group that call themselves Independent Sage, on the other hand, called to maintain, even increase restrictions at that time. The leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, predicted a summer NHS crisis and declared his opposition to Freedom Day then too. Well, quite possibly, if we'd maintained restrictions in the summer, we would be seeing the same sort of case surge that's going on in Europe right now as well. Cases, and more importantly, hospitalisations, could have surged at the same time as other winter pressure on the health service. Now, I'm not sage, I'm not in the business of making predictions on this, but if we continue to avoid that sharp, sudden spike that Europe's experiencing and the associated restrictions it instigates, our summer unlocking should be recognised as a masterstroke. And those that opposed it should apologise. But maybe this contention's wrong. Accountability matters. Let's revisit this in a few weeks' time to see who was right. Now, today is the day of Sir David Amos's funeral. It's also just over a week since the bomb went off outside Liverpool Women's Hospital. Yet, extraordinarily quickly, both these acts of terrorism have drifted from the news agenda. We've spent the last week talking about standards reform in Parliament and whether some trains are going to get 10 or 20 minutes faster. How on earth did this happen? Should we be talking about terrorism more? Or do we, along with the government, simply put it in the too difficult box? Well, to discuss this and how Number 10 is responding to it, I'm delighted to be joined by Nick Timothy, who of course served as Joint Downing Street Chief of Staff to Theresa May in her first year as Prime Minister. Welcome to the programme, Nick. Why are we no longer talking about terrorism?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is actually from an operational perspective, we obviously have world-class security and intelligence agencies. We have policing expertise in counterterrorism. And while it might be the case that in the media and in politics, we are, I think, nervous, reluctant to talk about it, that job done by those experts goes on and is done with serious professionalism. But it is the case, as you just suggested in your question, that I think we've actually regressed. I think in the years following the 7/7 attack under Tony Blair, the country started to have much more of a debate about the nature of the threat we face, about what we might need to do to equip ourselves in the fight against it. I think in the David Cameron years, during which I worked in the Home Office under Theresa May, we were, I think, pretty robust and were fully prepared to engage in quite difficult conversations. But it does feel like we've regressed on this subject. And the incredible thing to me is just 3 days after there was a suicide bombing outside a maternity hospital in a British city, at Prime Minister's questions, not a single member of Parliament thought to ask the Prime Minister about the terrorist threat that we face.
It is extraordinary. I mean, we've seen our threat level raised from substantial to severe, which means that another attack is highly likely. It seems that we are under greater threat now than we have been in previous years. And yet people were talking a lot more about terrorism at the time of the Charlie Hebdo affair of sort of the early 2010s. Why has the conversation moved so drastically away at a time when the threat seems to have increased?
Well, the threat definitely goes up and it goes down based on the assessment of the experts in the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, and they clearly do believe that the threat level is raised at the moment. It has been this high before. I don't think it necessarily means that we should be especially afraid or anything like that, but it does mean that we face a serious threat that we need to take seriously. Now, why is it that the threat level is up? Well, radicalization is a complicated process. There are tens of thousands of subjects of interest on MI5 databases. They can only actually monitor a certain number of those, so there's a complicated process of triage for them to work out who they need to have eyes on. And recently, we've seen, we've had the country locked down. We've had, I think, a lot of social consequences to lockdown. One of them, I think we will find, sadly, is that a lot of people who are already kind of in the orbit of radical ideas and radical beliefs have spent a lot of time online and will be perhaps ready to go to the next step and do something violent.
But also there seems to be a problem here in terms of how we deal with people when we find out if they are a threat or not. The Liverpool bomber appeared to have his asylum application rejected many years ago after he was wielding a knife in public, and yet he was able to stay in the country for many years after that. Is that a failure in government?
Well, I mean, I think in individual cases you can always point to failures, but there is a systemic problem with the asylum. Pretty difficult to remove somebody from the country once they are here, because the operational people who are responsible for trying to remove failed applicants from the country get caught in this loop of human rights, legal appeals, policies and processes actually prompted by human rights laws, where they have to give 3 days notice to somebody before they forcibly remove them from the country. Which obviously leads to people absconding. There are complications in terms of asylum seekers denying their nationality and claiming to be from a country that they're not from. Sometimes they don't have paperwork because they've destroyed them as part of the under the advice of people who have helped them to come into the country illegally. Sometimes the country of origin refuses to accept that they are indeed from that country, so they refuse to take them. And so we're caught in this kind of loop of failure, if you like, where even if you address one or two of those problems, you will still end up failing to remove the person because you can't address all of them. We need to completely reinvent the asylum system so that this doesn't happen anymore.
Well, that sounds like an enormous task. Just finally in this conversation, what do you think the chances are of that actually happening?
Well, I think the government's making some good steps in the legislation that is going through Parliament. It seems clear that Priti Patel is in favour of moving to a system of offshore processing, where when people claim asylum in Britain, they're actually taken to a different country and their claim is processed overseas. That would break the link between asylum claims and the ability to stay and work and live in this country, which I think would be very welcome. I think it would probably reduce the number of spurious claims, the number of economic migrants using the asylum system to be able to stay in the country. But obviously that will take time. There are other solutions too, which will also take time. Perhaps negotiating agreements with other countries to accept asylum seekers on our behalf. Perhaps to create longer prison sentences for people entering the country illegally, so that they know that if they do come here illegally and they've travelled from a safe country. They can't just start to work and live here. They actually face a penalty. And in the long term, also, we need to do something about the desirability of staying in the country, whether that's about looking at things like ID cards or clamping down quite considerably on the ability to rent housing and to work in the black economy.
Well, it's a huge, huge task. I'm not sure if the current construction of number 10 is up to it. We'll see as the weeks and months go on. But it's a really important topic of conversation to come back to, because it has drifted down so many news agendas in what has just been one day over 1 week. But Nick Timothy, thank you very much for joining me this morning on The Briefing, a really important topic to discuss there. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today on The Briefing on GB News, but do tune in at midday for Gloria De Piero, who is interviewing Jonathan Ashworth, the Shadow Health Secretary. And coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick Christie's and Mercy Moroki. That's just after the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Now, looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking largely dry with plenty of sunshine, although the far north will be cloudier. Let's take a look at the details. The southwest will continue to see lots of sunshine during the rest of today, and it will feel a tad warmer than yesterday, with highs possibly reaching 10 Celsius. Across the southeast, it will be dry, sunny, but cold for many. However, the coastal areas may see some showers throughout the day. Into Wales, we may also see the odd stray shower near the coast. Otherwise, it will be cold and sunny. The sun will also shine across the Midlands during the rest of today, with very little cloud in the sky. Despite the sun, it will be cold with a high of 8 degrees Celsius. Now, moving across into northern England, and the best of the sunshine will be across the west. Some shower clouds affecting eastern coasts throughout the day. Top temperatures here of 8 Celsius. Now, southern Scotland will also see the sunshine, but further north it will be rather cloudy with some spells of rain. It will be milder here, though